Hi, my name is Ella Koskinen, and today I'll be presenting my EDT 454 field presentation. So, how did I go about gaining experience? I listened and watched a lot of podcasts and videos. So, some of the podcasts and videos I'll be talking about and covering within this presentation are some Cults of Pedagogy podcasts called An Interview with an ESL Teacher and 12 Ways to Support English Learners in the Mainstream Classroom. And then I watched some OCA live lessons as well as supplementary videos, and one of the videos that I'll talk about is from Coloring, Colorado. So I wanted to start this presentation off talking about the 6 principles that we have discussed thus far in the semester in our book. So the first one is know your learners. Second, create conditions for language learning. Third, design high-quality lessons for language development. Fourth, adapt lesson delivery as needed. Fifth, monitor and assess student language development. And 6, engage and collaborate within a community of practice. So as I go through each of the ways that I've gained experience, I'll just connect those kind of to the theories that we have talked about with these 6 principles. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the podcast that I listened to, 12 Ways to Support English Learners in the Mainstream Classroom. And as you can see, there's 12 different ways that the podcast host had discussed. You guys can obviously read, so I won't just read it off the slide, but this was definitely very eye-opening and gave it like a very simple bulleted list that a teacher could implement in their classroom. So I thought this was very useful, and there's a lot of ties to theory. As you can see, here's some ties that I saw. So the first one was, it talks about making it visual, which I saw that related to principle 3 with comprehensible input, and that's talking about when teachers add visuals or audio supports to written text, they increase the comprehensibility of the material. So anything to make it visual is a great way to help ELs. And the second one is talking about learning about the cultural backgrounds of your students. And this relates to principle 1 that we've talked about, knowing your learners. So teachers can gain information about their students in order to embrace and leverage the resources that the learners bring to the classroom to enhance learning. So I think those are 2 important ties to theory that I saw within the podcast. Next, we'll look at an interview with an ESL teacher. And so the woman being interviewed goes on to just talk about what her experience was within being an ESL teacher. But the one thing that stood out to me was this story. So there was a student from Honduras, and the teacher was complaining to him about the length of the flight from Chicago to Vienna, which was about 7 hours. And the student interjected to explain that he only had to walk for 3 days to get from Honduras to his school. 3 days. So Kim went on to say, teach this kid. He walked 3 days to get here. Do you see what I'm saying? You're looking for kids who are motivated. This one. He walked 3 days. And so I think with this story in mind, it's imperative for us to know the stories that got our students to our classroom and the background that they are willing to share. Not only does this relate to practice 1 of talking about knowing your learners, but I think more specifically of how can we tangibly do that, and that looks like home visits or student autobiography projects talked about in practice 1B. Next was from OCA Live Lesson 1, and this teacher, I think, did a great job of using standards, using quizzes, checking in with the students, and being able to be flexible for the next session. So some of the ties to theory that I saw was using quizzes, which relates to principle 3G, which talks about self-regulated learning. And quizzes is a self-paced quiz system that checks our understanding, which is a great self-assessment tool. So I definitely think this would be something great to use in the classroom. She also did a really good job of checking with the student, which relates to principle 4A, and the student, you're able to evaluate student understanding in real time, and then adjust the instruction according to their responses. The other live lesson that I watched, they were talking about ancient culture and its relations to kids during those time periods. The student was given the option of reading aloud or having the teacher read aloud, and the student chose to read, but she ended up making a mistake. The teacher ended up correcting her, and then as they went on, they were filling out a graphic organizer that they compared and contrasted the different ancient cultures. So some ties to theory with that is that when she made a mistake, the teacher gave some effective oral feedback right away. And so this relates to principle 5B of teachers provide ongoing effective feedback strategically. And then also with the comparing and contrasting, this is a great use of graphic organizers, and it allows the student to see the information out in just the ways that it compares and contrasts to each other. And then the last thing that I watched was the Coloring Colorado video, and this was probably my favorite and most beneficial thing that I watched or listened to during the 10 field hours, because I was able to see how she was able to do this in person rather than just like over through a screen. And something that stuck out to me was the way that she worked with vocabulary. So she displays the word, has students say the words, uses a related image, and then provides an example sentence. They're also provided with their own glossary, and then at the very end, she would give her students a exit slip to give them an informal assessment. So with ties to theory for that, we're talking a lot about vocabulary here. It relates to principle 3C because she's focusing on the trickiest and most essential vocab. And she wants to engage learners in the use and practice of authentic language. And then exit slips. This definitely relates to principle 5C, which is talking about formative assessments, because this allows us to support student learning. So lastly, some of my recommendations is first, we have to know the principles. So we need to know the 6 principles, but more importantly, we have to be able to apply them. So I think that takes a lot of observation. At least that's how I feel like I'm going to grow as a learner, is observing other people doing it and then being able to implement it for myself. But if I had to pick 2 things, I think the biggest 2 recommendations would be knowing your students, so knowing the backgrounds that they come from and who they are and what makes them who they are, and then also using scaffolding. So building on what they already know and all the different facets of ways to use scaffolding, so like graphic organizers or comprehensible input, those things. So I think those are the 2 main recommendations that I would have. What I talked about in my paper is if we have all these things in front of us and we want our students to succeed, why don't we just try and implement it the best that we can? So I think that's what it comes down to, is trying to do it the best that we can. So thank you.